Well, this is my second lecture, which is about geopolitics and empire. What I mean by geopolitics, and I think I ought to say this right at the start, is the impact of geography on politics. And I mean by that, for example, where a particular polity is on the global map, who its neighbors are. I also just mean the politics of scale. And I will explain in the course of the lecture precisely what I mean by that and what the implications of the politics of scale are. All right, just to start off then very gently with Eurasian geopolitics. And by that I mean Eurasian geopolitics before the European discovery of the New World, before the integration of the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, and Eurasia into one increasingly united global system. So I'm talking about the period from about 1500 before the Common Era to about 1500 Common Era, about 3,000 years, 2,500. Fine. The basic point about Eurasia and the traditional geopolitics of Eurasia are that a great deal depended on whether a sedentary polity, society, civilization was or was not close to the centers of nomadic power. The greatest center of nomadic power is the enormous steppe grassland, which stretches, roughly speaking, from Manchuria in the east to Hungary in the west, northern Eurasia. The absolute quintessential home of the nomad, the horse, etc., pastoral societies. A secondary nomadic center, Arabia, a third one, North Africa. And as I say, an enormous amount depends in terms of the historical evolution of the sedentary polities, the sedentary empires, just how close they were, just how vulnerable they were to the steppe nomad. This is not to suggest that the entire relationship between nomads and sedentary society is a military one based on conquest, etc., etc. It wasn't. There was, a very important trading relationship. There were also interesting cultural ties. But you shouldn't downplay the military element. The basic point is that even if you were dealing with an economic, commercial relationship between sedentary and nomadic societies, the nomads were usually able, as you might put it, to tilt the advantage in their direction by using military power as a form of leverage in order to get the best end of the bargain in commercial deals, to put things crudely. I mean, the most basic point is that on the whole, and this is a generalization which is not always true, but on the whole, nomadic societies, nomadic polities are in military terms more formidable than sedentary ones. And that for a number of reasons. The most basic one is that in a nomadic society, virtually every adult male is a part-time soldier. He is brought up from the earliest days in the saddle to ride a horse, to shoot with a very formidable composite bow. He is trained as a huntsman, he is trained as a herder, and all of this feeds into the same basic kinds of skills and even, in fact, tactics as cavalry warfare. So although nomadic societies are, in terms of population, far less numerous than sedentary ones, the fact that 1 out of every 4 nomads, i.e. not the females, but half the males, can in emergency be turned out as a cavalryman, whereas in a sedentary society, the great majority of the population are tied to their farms, tied to their cities, etc., etc. Helps to explain pretty quickly why a nomadic society is more formidable. It is also, there are other factors. I mean, if you're a sedentary society facing nomads, you've got a number of disadvantages. Firstly, your farming population, which is the bulk of the population, has to be there to till its fields. It can't just disappear. It is not trained in cavalry warfare, cannot be. It's a sort of militia. Okay, it can be called out to defend its little local area. It can be called out to defend a city's walls, but it has none of the mobility of a cavalry army. Some of the more sophisticated sedentary societies try to form regular armies with which to keep the nomads at bay. And I think I gave you an example yesterday of Sung, China, which has a professional army, standing army of 1 million men. That is an enormous strain on the budget, of course. It's also the case that a standing army sits around most of the time in its barracks doing nothing except eating and costing the state money. Its nomadic enemies, on the contrary, are herding, they're carrying out their basic economic activity. Beyond that, the point about sedentary societies is that they have, by definition, static targets, static sources of wealth, etc., etc. They have their farms, their fields, their towns, their factories, etc. All of these are targets for nomads. And nomads, because of the mobility of a cavalry army in the steppe, can strike here, strike there, strike tomorrow. You never know where they're going to come or when they're going to come. You can't be strong everywhere. If, as always, happens every now and then, the sedentary society concentrates its forces, decides to strike the nomads, the problem is they don't have static assets to the same extent as a sedentary society. Right the way back into ancient history, you have the frustrations of, let's say, earlier Achaemenid emperors who chase these nomads back into the steppe forever. And their armies end up by starving. The nomads don't have cities to sack. They don't have farms to burn, etc., etc. They're far more slippery, in other words. Now, as I say, this is a generalization. Sometimes sedentary societies do inflict huge damage on their nomadic neighbors. There's a great example, which I think I cite more than once in my book, in the 2nd century Common Era, when the Han Dynasty Emperor Wu Di sends a huge force, which basically does such damage, kills such a large proportion of the Xiongnu Confederation nomads, that the Xiongnu Confederation never recovers. So it happens. But the basic tilt in terms of power is towards the nomad. That is to some extent offset by the fact that in political terms, on the whole, sedentary societies have the edge on the nomads. And that is precisely because some of the strengths in military terms of nomads are also some of their political weaknesses. The obvious fact is that, of course, nomads are more difficult to control for a government. There is also deep in nomadic steppe culture the idea that leadership belongs to the ruling clan rather than to a single monarch. There's no static system of succession, regular system of succession. All the great nomad empires are brought down by civil wars over succession as much as anything else, etc., etc., etc. But, just to sum up, if you were going to make a sort of crude generalization, nomads are militarily superior. Many of the greatest empires that I study either are directly nomad, the Mongols being the absolute apogee of nomad empire, or they are a sort of nomads once removed. In other words, warrior dynasties, war bands whose origins lie on the steppe, but who have migrated southwards or westwards or eastwards, whatever. And 3 of the dynasties to which I devote chapters, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Qing, these are, in one sense or another, nomads once removed. Moving from being a purely nomadic conquering warband with its leader to becoming, as the Ottomans do, or the Qing do, or the Mughals do, the rulers of sedentary empires is a complicated process. More nomadic war bands and leaders attempt to do that than actually succeed. it is quite difficult to turn nomadic warriors into the ruling elite of a static empire, to turn them from being conquering warriors always on the move to being, landowners, officials, enforcers of tax collection, this kind of thing. There are many, many sort of complicated balances involved. And rather than attempting to set them all out now, I'll give you one example and then leave you to read the book. I think the most interesting example in many ways is the last Chinese dynasty, the Qing, the Manchu, in other words, where you have this fascinating setup in which the Manchu, the conquering vast warband, itself mostly, but by no means exclusively, descended from the Jurchens, who conquered North China in the 12th and 13th centuries. They take over the whole of China. They, to some extent, adopt Chinese high culture. They work in a kind of symbiotic relationship with the core Chinese population, with the Qing dynasty to an extent using the Chinese elite bureaucracy to control the more anarchical elements of the Manchu warrior nomad tradition, while at the same time using the sort of tamed Manchu ex-nomadic elite to act as a sort of super controlling element over the Chinese bureaucratic system. It is a fascinating study in compromise, trade-off, both merging and distinction between the two peoples. And I found it absolutely fascinating. It is sui generis, but it is part of a broader history of the way that initially nomadic or semi-nomadic warrior bands and dynasties make the transition to sedentary empire without losing all the martial skills and traditions that their nomadic origin entails. Fascinating. Won't say anything more about that. I mean, basically, if you're looking at this whole period, which I was talking about, in other words, sort of the 3,000 years down to 1500 CE, you could generalize, and again, it wouldn't be entirely true, but you could generalize by saying that on the whole, if you're looking at Eurasia, Western Europe, Southeast Asia, and Japan are beyond beyond the reach of nomads. That's partly simply distance. It's also partly that nomadic cavalry armies don't live very happily in the jungles of Southeast Asia. To get to Japan, they've got to cross a sea. I mean, that's the origin of kamikaze, divine wind. The Mongols were actually very adaptable. They did create fleets, but partly because this was a new type of warfare, and partly sheer chance, divine wind. They didn't succeed in making that jump. In Western Europe, it's a bit less clear-cut. After all, the end of the Western Roman Empire is to some extent the product of movements on the steppe with populations flowing westwards, etc., etc., etc. What remains true, though, is that after 500, 600 CE, Western Europe is basically beyond the nomads' reach. The Mongols, of course, come, they raid into Central Europe and devastate, Central European feudal armies. But in the first place, this is a long way from home. Secondly, why bother to conquer Western Europe when neighboring China and Iran are so much juicier, so much better targets? So is the North Indian plain, So it's a question of push and pull. But if you're going to generalize from, the era of the rise of Islam, the end of the West Roman Empire, down to 1500, if you're looking at centers of power, you've got the nomads, you've got the Islamic world, and you've got Chinese empire. With, the balance in terms of power shifts between the three, but those are certainly the foremost types of polity in Eurasia. Of course, the Islamic world itself, if you're looking at the early caliphate and the Islamic conquests, the force which drives them is a combination of military nomadism and the enormous cultural but also political power of this new conquest religion, in other words, Islam. If you're looking at the greatest of the Chinese dynasties in terms of territorial expense, they are actually conquest dynasties. They're not the native Chinese dynasties. They're the Tang, the Yuan, in other words, the Mongols, and the Qing, in other words, the Manchu, combining the power of Chinese empire and the resources of Chinese empire with the military skills which the nomadic conquerors from the north bring. And right at the bottom of this list comes little Western Europe, Latin Europe. From the fall of the Roman Empire down to the 16th century, unequivocally below both Islamic empire and Chinese empire and the military power of the nomads on the steppe, squashed into the westernmost corner of Eurasia, unable to expand because they're blocked to the east by the nomads of the steppe and to the south by Islam. And then you get the dramatic shift with the 16th and 17th centuries, the opening of the Atlantic Ocean. And that is still probably to this day the single most fundamental geopolitical shift in world history, certainly world political and economic history. What it actually means is that a Europe, Latin Europe, which had previously been hemmed in one relatively small corner of Eurasia, the Latin Christians can't even actually establish a base on the southern shore of the Mediterranean. They even can't hold Jerusalem for more than about 100 years, etc., etc. Now, suddenly, they discover a new steppe highway all of their own. And that steppe highway is the ocean. And the ocean, once you begin to master the navigational maritime skills, is an even better highway than the steppe itself. You can travel further distances with fewer obstacles, etc., 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 etc. The conquest of the Americas transforms the global balance of power in the long run. The Atlantic becomes the center of the global economy in the long run. Actually, the big shift doesn't really come until the 18th century. The Safavid rulers of Iran are pushed out in 1720s. The Mughals lose all real power at roughly the same moment. It takes another 100 years for it to reach East Asia, the Chinese and the Japanese, in fact, somewhat more in the case of the Japanese. So one's talking about a long process, but already in the 16th and 17th centuries, what the Americas are giving to Europe are resources which give Europe something to offer to the Indians and the Chinese, and that above all means silver. That is the beginning of a shift in global power. And the first embodiment, if you like, of European power, growing European power in the world, and also the first global empire, is the empire of the Spanish Habsburgs. And I had a chapter on that, Charles V and Philip II. And I loved all my chapters, but that did have a specific fascination. In the first place, of course, this is a uniquely European, Latin European variant on empire. And the Habsburgs are this to a classic degree. It is the only empire I study which is mostly put together by marriage, not by conquest. And that is only possible in Europe. Again, you come back to this European uniqueness. It's not that dynasty is unimportant elsewhere in the world. It is important to varying degrees. Dynasty, for example, is much more important in China than it is in Rome, etc., etc., etc. But it is uniquely important in Europe, where the territory and empire is almost perceived, and in legal terms really is almost the private property of a family. And therefore is inherited as if it was private property. So you get dramatic shifts of enormous geopolitical importance because one boy dies and his sister then becomes the heiress and happens to have married, I don't need to repeat it all, but this is something unique. What that, of course, means is that because the Habsburgs inherit most of their empire, firstly, they have a uniquely legalistic conception of legitimacy. No Habsburg emperor thinks of himself as an absolute monarch. They are very aware of the fact that they rule within a web of rights, conventions, traditions, etc., which bind them as they bind their subjects. So this is a particular kind of empire. And it is an empire which is not uniform, because each of the territories they inherit has its own specific constitution, its own laws, etc., etc. That helps to explain why the sheer scale of Charles V's empire, to some extent, disguises many of its inner weaknesses. What you have in the 16th century is, for the first time since Charlemagne, a genuine pan-European would-be empire. And of course, one of the problems there is that it is potentially so powerful that it scares its rivals. It scares the other independent European polities. It often scares its own Catholic, even Catholic, would-be allies, etc., in Germany. It has all the resources of the Americas to bring into the weight of European politics, which is an extra reason to scare the other princes, etc. There are all sorts of reasons why the attempt by Charles V, Philip II, and then to an extent in the 30 Years' War, Ferdinand II, to recreate empire in Europe on an almost Roman scale, to reassert the domination of the Roman Catholic Church, etc., why that fails. And I've talked about one already. It is the fact that this is a conglomerate in which the emperor has to take into account the specific perspectives of elites, and more than elites, actually, different constitutions, etc. It's also because of Protestantism and the fact that the enemies of the Habsburgs can unite across borders because they are united precisely by a common religion and opposition to the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And one could find all sorts of other reasons why empire fails to reassert itself in Europe in the way that Charles V and Philip II hoped. Nevertheless, this is not inevitable, and it's very interesting to concentrate, albeit a bit briefly, on probably what was probably the Habsburgs' 2-3 decades of best opportunity to recreate true empire in Europe. And this is under Philip II. And the reasons for this, in other words, I'm talking about the 1560s, 70s, 80s. The basic point why this is the best opportunity is that the Habsburgs' main enemy, most powerful enemy in Europe, is France. France blocked Charles V's efforts to reassert empire in Europe, allied itself with the German Protestants, etc. But 1560s, 70s, 80s, France is laid low by civil war which is simultaneously religious and dynastic. France, therefore, to a significant degree, falls out of the equation, which gives the Habsburgs a real opportunity to push. On top of that, dynastic chance means that Philip II inherits the Portuguese crown and therefore the whole Portuguese empire. So the world's greatest, or certainly Europe's greatest empire, the first great global empire, suddenly, by chance, acquires the world's second largest global empire, Portugal. This is real opportunity. And it is blown above all else because of the Dutch revolt. And the reason for looking just for a minute at the Dutch revolt is that it tells you something quintessential about the problems of empire. In the first place, Philip II is in Madrid. You don't need to be an expert on European geography to understand that the Netherlands are rather a long way from Madrid. and you've got most of the territory in between, or part of the territory in between, occupied by the Habsburgs' rivals. So you've got a difficult process of getting troops, getting information, getting orders by land, or you've got to go around that terrifying Atlantic passage, which is not something you would wish to do, particularly in winter with the sailing ships of that day. So you've got distance, and distance is always one of the problems in empire. Then you've got the fact that distance means, it is very hard to react quickly to emergencies. The Dutch Revolution, like all revolution, is a matter of emergencies. Chances lost today are lost for good. They don't recur tomorrow. You've got to be able to seize opportunities, react quickly, etc., etc. And you can't if you're the other end of the world. Then, in a very typical manner, when the Dutch revolt first blows up, Philip has got essentially two lieutenants in the Netherlands who disagree about whether fundamentally one should try and conciliate the rebels or crush them. So in that crucial first period, policy wobbles, and Philip himself is too far away in Madrid to knock heads together. When he does and goes for repression, full-scale military counter-revolution, to a great extent in military terms, he wins, but in a way that resonates right down to the Americans in Vietnam and time again in the history of empire. Obviously, with the French in Algeria in the 50s and early 60s, you can win military or come close to winning military in military terms, but it doesn't actually result in a political settlement. And the effort you put into winning militarily, repression and victory, actually alienates the local elites on whose support long-term empire depends. And that goes a long way to explaining why Philip doesn't succeed in reasserting Habsburg power in the Netherlands. Apart from anything else, and again, this is a quintessential problem of empire, but more extreme in those days than when governments are more, resilient and have more resources later. If you cannot tax the local population, which you cannot do without the collaboration of local elites, then you have to pay for all the costs of repression yourself, which of course creates, again, a spiral. And then the final point, and again, this is typical, again, one could talk about, Vietnam. It makes all the difference that once the Habsburgs get tied down in trying to repress the Dutch rebellion, the Dutch find support from outside powers, which above all means England in the 1570s and 1580s. And then, in a curious way, the Habsburg Emperor, or the King of Spain as he was, Philip II, faces what is again a quintessential problem of sedentary emperor faced by nomads, but this time faced by sea nomads. Here you are, if you're the King of Spain, you have assets on both sides of the Atlantic, towns, ports, mines, all these things. These are static. You cannot be strong everywhere. You cannot defend every port. You cannot defend every city. You cannot defend every convoy. Meanwhile, the Dutch and the English are sea pirates, sea nomads. They can strike here, there, everywhere. You never know where they're coming next. So in a manner very familiar to Chinese emperors, Philip's top advisors, and indeed the king himself, say, look, we cannot be strong everywhere. If we remain on the defensive, we are always going to be vulnerable because the sea nomads can choose where to attack. And it's a fool's game. We just can't react to them in time to stop them. So we must strike at the core of their power. And that is the Spanish Armada of 1588. The attempt, in other words, to strike at the heart of the sea nomad's power, which means England. And a way which is not the same, but has parallels with all the frustrations of trying to fight nomads, to get to the heart of the sea nomad's power, in other words, England, London. in one sense, it's easier because there is a target there. If you get there, you can take it, you can wipe them out. These are not nomads once they're back on land. But of course, although in terms of grand strategy, it makes sense to strike at the heart of their power, the Armada is the rational thing to do. Given the problems in the 16th century of mounting amphibious long-range operations across the oceans, with the sailing ships and the technology of that time, plus all the problems that, exist to this day in terms of amphibious operations, these are always the most complicated operations in warfare, Philip comes unstuck. Now, he is warned by his advisors that though in terms of grand strategy, the Armada is the right thing to do, in operational and tactical terms, it is extremely risky and will probably fail. But the king, in the first place, can see no alternative, and indeed there was no alternative. So he takes the risk. Secondly, we've got something I was talking about yesterday. By now, Philip is aging. He's been on the throne for 30 years. He's not, he's used to getting his way. He's less inclined than he was to listen to good advice. The people he used to take advice from, the elder statesman, the father, the uncle, all dead. Some of the stubbornness of old age is kicking in. And there's another element as well, which is, part of, I suppose, the human psyche. It's hubris. It's also a sense, which is very familiar to empire and the rulers of empire. And you get a bit of it even in contemporary America. You may well get it in, China in 10 or 15 years' time. The sense that history is on our side. We are the most powerful. We have been so successful for so many generations now, and in that pre-modern world, the sort of basic human assumption that, the wind is in our favor is always interpreted as God is in our favor. Things happen on earth because heaven allows them or even dictates them. There is this strong sense, not just in Philip, but in the Spanish elite, that we cannot fail because in the last resort, we are God's chosen agents. History, success proves that God is on our side. And if God is on our side, then who can be against us? This is specific, of course, to a particular Christian perspective, but it is part of a broader human tendency to equate one's own success with the will of God. Or, et cetera, or indeed with one's own merits, if you're talking about the contemporary world. Okay, so that is just to give you some initial sense of what I mean by geopolitics, above all in that age down to about 1600, though, as I've tried to sort of hint, in ways which do have a resonance beyond that. Now, let me say something about empire. And, this is a subject on which I've written a great deal, including a 600-page book. One could talk about this forever. I mean, part of the problem is that empire is one of the most predominant forms of polity in world history. Empires, or polities which we call empires, come in many different shapes and sizes. They have certain similarities, but they are also very different. On top of that, empires are by definition large and varied. So, you generalize about an empire, and actually your generalization is much more fitted to one part of it than to another. And on top of that, great empires last a long time. They evolve. They are not the same at the beginning, in the middle, at the end. Unless they're able to evolve, they wouldn't survive. I mean, the Roman Empire is a classic example of that. It is precisely the genius of the Roman elite in the first century BCE, first century CE, that they evolve the republican empire towards the monarchical empire, evolve their institutions, accept a number of compromises, etc., which allows the empire to survive new challenges, not least the challenge of simple scale. And they do that again in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And to some extent, if you take it into the Byzantine Empire, they do it again as well. Well, in other words, if one is thinking about empire, one is thinking about a kaleidoscope moving through space and time. You simply cannot find 3 or 4 words which sum up the essence of empire across history. Any definition, unless it is so vague as to be meaningless, is likely to fit better some empires than others. That is all I would say as a first comment. The second comment, of course, is that empire has now been for at least 100 years a very politically charged concept. In other words, the debates about empire are not just scholarly debates about terms. They are linked to enormously important contemporary political disputes, which of course makes the whole discussion even more complicated. I think it is fair to say that ideas about empire, the idea about what empire is or isn't, is still to a very large extent, at least in the Western world, linked to the history of the early modern and modern West European transoceanic empires. The English, British, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and that's about it. And to some extent, coming along after that, the Americans. Why is that the case? Well, I think it's pretty simple. In the first place, for the last 300 years at least, slightly more than that probably, the predominant power in the world has belonged to what we call the West, and above all else, to the Anglophone West. They dominate most things in terms of world history, so it's hardly surprising that their empires and their perception of empires is the one which dominates most of the historiography. After all, if you're talking about history faculties, the leading faculties of history in the world for a very long time have been in Europe or European North America. If you look at the Cold War, again, in a sort of surprising way, that reinforces the stress on Western transoceanic empire. The whole debate about imperialism, which was at the root of the Cold War, or heart of the Cold War, is linked to Lenin's conception of imperialism as the last stage in capitalism. And Lenin absolutely explicitly said that his idea of imperialism only had to do with the West European capitalist, most advanced societies and polities. It had nothing to do with the great dynastic and religious empires of pre-modern and ancient history. And then thirdly, and probably most important, if you're looking at the perspective from now, perfectly obviously, if you're trying, for example, to explain crucial elements of the contemporary world political order and their origins, the gap between the first world and the third world, north-south, as it's now sometimes put, obviously that is more rooted in the history of West European transoceanic empire than it is in the history of the Ottomans or, the Mughals or anything like this. And, that is really relevant when you think of burning contemporary political issues, climate change. The whole issue of who is going to pay for climate change, historical responsibility, is entangled in the history of empire. If you think of, the United States racked by ethnic, racial tension, which has completely dominated much of the discussion about American history by now. Again, one is talking about something rooted in the history of Western transoceanic empire. The slaves were brought from Africa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, all these factors together do mean, and this is a sort of warning to be a bit careful, that it is very easy for a contemporary audience, particularly a contemporary Western audience, to take for granted that empire means the transoceanic European empires. If you look at those empires, they have specific characteristics. If you look at them in 1900, for instance, there is an absolutely obvious yawning gap between metropolis and periphery. That is a geographical gap. The empire's on the other side of the sea. It is a gap in terms of wealth over the 18th and even more the 19th centuries. The gap, the gulf between the wealth of Western Europe and of the non-European world has grown exponentially. It is a racial gap. The Europeans are white. The people they dominate are usually not white. It is ongoing. It is an economic gap in the sense it's industrialized as against, etc., etc., etc. It is also, and very importantly, a gap between what are usually already in metropolitan Western Europe by 1900 polities of citizens. The gap between being a citizen in the United Kingdom or France or the Netherlands and a subject in the non-white colonies. So in all these kind of ways, you can see that the history of West European empire can actually, to a great degree, be summed up as political conquest and rule, alien rule, economic exploitation, and cultural domination. Now, what is interesting is to ask whether that definition fits all empires. And it does to varying degrees at varying times, not quite as well as it does when you're looking at the West European empires there. I mean, if you're looking at the nomadic empires, which I've been talking about, yes, of course, conquest. Yes, of course, exploitation. Nomadic conquerors did not go off and conquer sedentary societies in order to do them good. They went there in order to, exploit the population, exploit the resources, etc., 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 etc. What gets you into real trouble with the Western European definition is cultural domination. Because actually, usually, not merely were the nomadic conquerors in cultural terms less sophisticated than the sedentary societies they conquered, but they often recognize that fact. So in a way, you often actually have the conquering nomadic warband groups, elites, if you like, peoples, being conquered culturally by the sedentary societies they've occupied, to the extent that in certain cases they virtually disappear. I mean, there are now arguments as to what extent the Manchus became completely Sinified. Well, it is perfectly obvious that they did to a significant degree. So you can actually get a situation in which, far from the conquerors exercising cultural hegemony, as the Western ones do. I mean, one of the root causes of bitterness in the transoceanic European empires is that the Europeans have an enormous, sometimes devastating impact on the native societies. But actually, the metropolitan European societies barely notice in certain cases that they have empires. Most English people couldn't even name more than a few of the British colonies in 1900. Once you're dealing with the nomadic empires, things get very different indeed. It's a quite different pattern of cultural relationship. What about Rome? Rome, apart from the transoceanic modern West European empires, this is the quintessential empire. Quite apart from anything else, I mean, the British, certainly. I remember at my boarding school being told that, the British Empire was the direct descendant of the Roman Empire, and these were the only two great empires in history. The same idea, civilizing mission, etc., 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 etc. Well, I mean, if you look at the early Roman Empire, the Republican Roman Empire in particular, it fits the definition beautifully. Obviously, the Romans were a distinct people. They conquered first Italy and then much of the Mediterranean. They exploited it. Roman elites grew hugely, grossly rich on the proceeds of empire. But even the Roman plebs got free food distribution, etc., etc., etc. There was a big distinction between being a Roman citizen and being a subject of the empire, etc., etc., etc. Slightly complicated when you talk about cultural domination and the Roman relationship to the Greeks. There you are more equivocal about whether it isn't straight cultural domination. A good deal of the Roman elite actually saw Greek culture as superior and certainly borrowed an enormous amount from Greek culture. But the big point about the Roman Empire is that it evolves. It's that the Republican Empire, the empire even of Augustus, is very different indeed to the empire of even 180 CE, let alone 300 CE, to a unique degree. Firstly, the Romans in 212 actually abolished the distinction between being a citizen and being a subject. Most of the male free population of the empire get all the rights of citizenship, which means, of course, that the rights of citizenship lose much of their salience. But it is also, and this is more unique, to a degree, empires which survive usually do absorb local elites. They give them an honored place in empire to varying degrees. And this is very interesting. There are, differences across the board. But the Roman Empire is actually unique among the empires I know in allowing provincial, non-Roman, and very soon not even Italian elites to actually take over the empire at the top. Meaning that by 200 CE, most senators and most emperors are not even, well, they're certainly not Roman any longer, and most emperors are not even Italian. So that is very fascinating. And then you get that further evolution with Christianity arriving. So that in a sense, what you were ending up with, and certainly what you get after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is a sort of proto-Christian nation. And there are a lot of arguments about what calling this proto-Christian nation, well, nation's the wrong word, community, an empire means. Obviously at one level, this is still in ethno-linguistic terms, certainly as regards the plebs, the bulk of the population, diverse peoples. But the elites more or less unite around a common culture, a common religion, a common political identity. And one of the most interesting historians of the Byzantine Empire whom I have read says that, the Byzantine Empire is not to be seen as an empire in terms of multi-ethnicity. Ethno-linguistic identity doesn't mean much, he says. What does matter is religious, cultural, and political homogenization among the elites, who see themselves as an empire because they are ruled by an emperor, because they are firm in their belief that they are the heirs of imperial Rome and its traditions, because they see themselves as the only true great Christian polity, but not in terms of the definition of empire that we would think of coming from West European transoceanic empire. They don't have that sense. They think of themselves as a single homogeneous community. And what is very interesting is to compare that to the Chinese. After all, 2,000 years ago, we had the Han Empire in East Asia and the Romans in Eastern Eurasia, the Romans in Western Eurasia. I mean, in a sense, what has happened in modern and contemporary China is that what was an empire with a sort of consolidated elite culture, but many initially different ethno-linguistic groups, has been turned over in time into a vast sort of imperial nation. I remember the first time I went out in the sticks in China, into non-Han Chinese areas, you could actually see the process going on. I think these were Miao, or Mao, I don't know how you pronounce it. They were tribal peoples, in other words, initially. But you could see them being turned into Han Chinese citizens through the educational system, through the state's propaganda network, through all the processes that we call modernization. And actually, if the Roman Empire had survived, it is very possible that if it had survived into modernity, the institutions of a modern state would have turned it into a vast European nation. With no doubt interesting local folklore, but fundamentally a common linguistic, political, and even cultural identity. So fascinating. That is a sort of, different vision of empire. And that takes me naturally on to talk, about Chinese empire. I mean, I think one day I will start a lecture on empire by saying, look, let us take as our paradigm of empire China. And that, after all, would be justified in terms of the fact that this is the oldest continuous imperial tradition on earth. It would be justified in terms of China's importance. It might actually be a bit of a shock, because although we have much talk about decentering in contemporary history faculties, and escaping the traditional, discourse and narrative of Western elites, sometimes described as Western males, always as whatever. Well, you get up in the United States or even Britain and start a lecture on empire by saying, let us take China as the paradigm. Let us take a relatively, let us be less interested, for instance, in Black Lives Matter or slavery, because actually all of this is of relatively lesser importance if the Chinese are going to be the dominant power, etc., etc., etc. Well, at that point, you bring home to people just what empire means. It means that my problems are at the center of attention. My identity is what matters. My history is what matters. That is power, in the end. And of course, you only really appreciate what power means when you lose it. When suddenly at the center of attention is someone else's history, someone else's dilemmas of identity, someone else's priorities, that becomes a different matter. I mean, there is, of course, a Chinese tradition of empire. It is rooted in ancient legends. It's rooted in a sort of negative way by the awful experience of the Warring States era, where you had sort of genocidal struggles to some extent between different states, which created a very strong push for empire to end constant wars, constant anarchy. And all of this is transferred through the debates between so-called Confucian legalists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is a whole body of thinking in that Warring States era which goes into the ideological foundations of empire. And then you have 2,000 years actually of dynastic empire in China, which provides history, mythology, but also institutions and memories, all of which become part of a very specifically Chinese conception of empire. The most fundamental point of all being that there is near unanimity behind the idea that the only legitimate polity in China is one which actually controls the entire Chinese space. Okay, so that is empire. And yet at the same time, very clearly, there are distinctions. And the most obvious of those is between what you would describe as the native Chinese dynasties, the most obvious being the Sung and the Ming, and the conquest dynasties, to some extent the Tang, certainly the Mongols and the Manchu. And the most crude and fundamental difference there is space. The Ming Empire at its apogee was 3.1 million square kilometers. The Qing, the Manchu, was 14.7 million. Is one actually talking about the same kind of polity at that point? When the difference in scale is so immense. You could, I think, in European terms, or in terms certainly of the definition I offered of empire derived from West European transoceanic empire, almost claim that the Sung and the Ming were vast proto-Chinese nations, nation states, with some non-Chinese bits tacked on at the edges. Whereas, of course, the Qing Empire is perfectly obviously a vast multi-ethnic empire, though sui generis, because of the particular relationship between Manchus and Chinese. So it is fascinating, and it is not, of course, irrelevant in terms of contemporary politics. Rather interestingly, I just got a very nice offer from the Chinese for translation rights for my new book. But one of the things that they insisted on was that I change my statistics for the size of the Ming, Qing, Tang, Sung empires in terms of territory, population, different ethnic groups, because of course it is extremely touchy to say that, whereas the Sung and the Ming were proto-nations, the Qing were actually an empire. Because after all, the People's Republic of China is the heir of the Qing in territorial terms, not of the Sung or the Ming. And if it is indeed the heir of empire, does it legitimately have the right to rule over Xinjiang or Tibet or even Taiwan? So these kind of issues really still resonate in ways which are very important and very fascinating. On to my final section, or almost final section. What then are my definitions of empire? And my definitions of empire are minimalist. To me, an empire, and this is its most important element, has to be a very powerful polity. In our terms, a very great power. Unless you are a power which dominates international relations in a significant part of the world for a significant period, to my mind, you are not really worth calling an empire. On the other hand, I think it is true, undoubtedly, that power is not just hard power, not just military and economic. It is also very much soft power, ideological, cultural, you name it. Look, one little example. The Mongols had the greatest empire in history in terms of territory until the British came along. In pure territorial terms, it was significantly bigger than the empire of the Caliphate, of the Umayyads and the Abbasids. And yet, in terms of world historical importance, beyond any question, the Caliphate is more important than the Mongols. The Caliphate is rooted in less impressive military power than the Mongols. Arabia is a less impressive basis for nomadic military power than the Eurasian steppe. But on the other hand, the early caliphate is buttressed by this enormously important soft power called Islam. And not merely does that make it much more important, for a longer period in its time, it resonates right down to the present day. If you were talking about the great geopolitical and geocultural divides in the world, the existence of an Islamic community is, of course, absolutely fundamental. In other words, the Caliphate has left a much bigger mark on history than the Mongols, and that is because of soft power. But empire, to me, is not just a great power. It is a great power with specific characteristics, one of which is multi-ethnicity, many peoples, however you define ethnicity. The other is simply that it is, in territorial terms, huge. And I'll say just something about those points, though I would mention before that I have in the past dabbled with the idea that empires, apart from these characteristics, are not based on the explicit consent of the governed. In other words, trying to make the point that a modern, vast, continental scale, multi-ethnic federation, democratic federation, is not an empire. Now, I think that is true, but it is also really, once one brings in this question of consent, you muddy the waters. Because consent in the formal democratic terms that we think about it today is meaningless before the 20th century or before the 19th and 20th centuries everywhere in the world. So trying to decide what is an empire in terms of whether the population consents to rule takes you down a rabbit hole and gets you nowhere. So I would stick with my three key elements: great power, great scale, multi-ethnicity. Okay, start just with a word on multi-ethnicity. I mean, the obvious point here is a warning. With rare exceptions in the pre-modern era, no great political consequences or implications were attached to ethno-linguistic identity. This is to do with Herder and 19th century ideas of nationalism. In the pre-modern world, you did sometimes have empires faced with what one might describe as proto-nationalist challenges. The most obvious example is the Jews and the Roman Empire. But you are dealing with a very specific conception of chosen people there with the Jews. This is not typical. Most empires for most of history were much more challenged, either by mass movements based on poverty, economic collapse, or by religious millenarian movements. Ethno-linguistic identity tends to mean much less than religious identity, class identity, etc., etc., etc. Of course, once you do get the emergence of modern democratic nationalist, ethno-linguistic nationalist movements and ideologies, that is fatal. I mean, it is a dagger in the heart of hereditary monarchy. It is a dagger in the heart, even more so, of hereditary imperial monarchy. If each people, defined by ethnicity, language, and to some extent history, has a right to its own state, then that is the end of empire, etc., etc. I could launch off into a great harangue now about what the implications of that are, but I probably won't. I think I will leave that for discussion in the seminars. All I would note is that towards the end of the 19th century, the chief legal advisor to the Russian foreign ministry, a man called Fyodor Martins, made, I think, the excellent point that if you applied the principle of nationalism to every ethno-linguistic identity, there should be statehood. That was a recipe for utter chaos in the vast area of the world governed by the Romanovs, Habsburgs, and Ottomans. And indeed, we are still living with the consequences of empire's collapse in this vast part of the world, all the way from Crimea to Iraq to Palestine, across the Middle East. And it is worth noting that the great nations or the great polities of Asia, with rare exceptions such as Japan, are actually in many ways more like empires than they are like the European model ethno-linguistic state. And if Asia catches European nationalist disease, the planet probably won't survive. So we could talk about that in the discussion. What I will say a word or two about instead is scale. Huge scale territory. Huge scale means huge resources. And this, to an extent, takes one back to the discussion yesterday, or my comments in my lecture yesterday about the city-state, the basic problem being that the city-state simply does not have the resources to defend itself against neighboring monarchies, let alone neighboring empires. So the city-state tends to become a relatively peripheral factor when you're talking about great power politics. Much of the history of mankind is therefore the history of empire, simply because empires agglomerate enormous resources, enormous power. And as they agglomerate enormous resources and power, they are almost unstoppable in terms of expansion. But of course, they always do reach a natural limit. It may be another empire, it may be a mountain range, it may be an ocean, you never know it. Also, for all their power, there is an inherent weakness in empire. Vast territories, given pre-modern communications, are extremely difficult to control, let alone to exploit successfully. So you tend to have this circular rise and fall of empires. Sometimes, you can see their fall in terms of the implosion of the center, very often over succession struggles, for instance. Once the center implodes, the various peripheral areas break away under the control of local elites, viceroys, you name it. I think as a basic point, if you're looking about to the long-term stability and survival of empire, the single most important point, certainly in terms of domestic politics, is a stable alliance between local elites and the central authority, the monarchy. A stable alliance to share what you might describe as the peasant surplus. A stable alliance rooted in common interest, but also in common ideology, sometimes a religious ideology, common cultural and often religious solidarity. Again, this is not just a question of hard power and interest, it is also to do with culture, identity, you name it, you name it, you name it. What one could, I think, see history being, certainly in terms of international relations, is a sort of history of scale. I've already talked about this: city-state against empire, Greeks against Persians, Alexander of Macedon, you name it. It is interesting that when you come to the 18th century and Montesquieu, he is arguing that actually the most viable form of polity is the medium-sized European monarchy, agglomerating far greater resources than a mere city-state, but not unmanageable on the scale of empire. And because of its relatively limited territorial size, capable of balancing freedom and power. remember Montesquieu's great comment that a vast territory requires an autocratic system of government. Again, this to an extent is the old Greek idea of our liberty against vast imperial Asiatic despotism, empire. But Montesquieu is now talking not about the city-state, but about the medium-sized monarchy. And actually, if you look at, for example, the rise of Prussia in Europe, and the fact that Prussia succeeds in taking on an Austrian monarchy with 10 times more population, that has got a lot to do with having a polity on a scale which can be managed and developed. There's interesting literature about the origins of the Industrial Revolution, making the same point, comparing Britain and China. Looking at the effectiveness of government, the intensity of tax collection, etc., 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 and making this basic point that actually the medium-sized European state is better equipped to manage the process of modernization and industrial revolution than China. This is arguable. I mean, there are also arguments that Britain would not have had an industrial revolution had it not conquered an overseas empire. So, I mean, in and out. What is undoubtedly the case, though, is that the most powerful polities in the world in 1800 are European polities smaller than the great Eurasian empires, with the exception of Russia, which I'll talk about tomorrow. But then you get the shift back from the mid-19th century, and this really is to do with the first phase of globalization. And this is very important because it actually determines the geopolitical context which exists down to the modern day. The basic point here, and this is something which the first great British geopolitical thinker Mackinder said, is that globalization, and particularly the development of the railway, the steamship, the telegraph, shrinks distances, integrates the world, for the first time also makes it possible to exploit, colonize, etc., the heartlands of continents. What that means in his thinking, and of course the German geopolitical thinker said exactly the same, was that if you were going to be a truly great power in the 20th century, you were going to have continental scale. And not just Mackinder, but also all the Germans pointed to the United States, particularly after the great crisis of the 1860s had been overcome, looked at its enormous resources, its growing population, its vastly growing economy, and said, look, this is the model of a great power in the 20th century. No purely European nation state is going to be able to match that. We too need continental scale resources. The only way we can do that is through empire. And in its most horrible variant, this is Hitler and Lebensraum in the East. There is, however, a basic dilemma here. At the same time that the logic of international power seems to be empire, continental scale and resources, the logic of domestic politics increasingly seems to be the nation and nationalism. Nationalism is the best ideology to integrate a community, to legitimize elites, etc., etc., etc. The power of nationalism, poo-pooed by, many people, certainly when I was younger, growls loudly in the contemporary world still. The idea of nationalism gives to individuals a sense of community. It gives a sense of place. It gives a sense of place, not just geographically. This is my home. This is my, the natural world in which I'm surrounded community, but also a place in history. A certain sense also of immortality. I may die as an individual, but the community lives forever, etc. Sometimes, of course, even a sense of individual heroism, transmitted into a collective heroism. So, you've got this dilemma. How do you combine the solidarity and the power of nationalism with the scale of empire? That was the big dilemma before 1914. It's the big dilemma right now. It is not a coincidence that, when we're looking at the future, we talk about the United States, China. We ask about the European Union. The European Union is an attempt to combine continental scale with accepting, local democracy in Europe. But Europe is the place which actually created modern nationalism and is still in hock to it. So it's on the one hand entirely right to say that unless you can mobilize the resources of a continent, you are going to be marginalized on many of the great issues of the future. Look, even in terms of the present struggle in Ukraine, let alone when one's looking at great issues of global trade or of coping with climate change. And yet, how do you legitimize government of a continental scale in the continent which created modern nationalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And one could go through the United States, China, India, et cetera, making the same kind of basic, comments, trade-offs, et cetera. I mean, just to sort of conclude this section, China is on the cusp of being a superpower, more than anything else, because better than any other empire, it has sustained its empire and has turned most of it into what you might describe as a nation. And there are all sorts of reasons for this, of which demography is the most significant. But, most of the European imperial elites and governments in 1900 sought salvation in the face of nationalist challenges by hoping to turn the core of their empire into something approaching a nation. That is Russification, that's Majorization, it's Germanization, it's British imperial federalism. The Chinese of all the great imperial traditions are the ones who have come closest to combining empire and nation. Okay, so just the last brief point I make. Look, I have barely talked about being an emperor. That's what I talked about in my last lecture. What does it mean to be an emperor as distinct from being just a king? And the answer is, it may not mean very much. If, for instance, you stayed in Europe and you looked at Louis XIV, who was a king, and his contemporary Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor, well, there's no question, firstly, who was more powerful, more arrogant, had a greater sense of, his leadership of Europe, if you like. And it wasn't the Holy Roman Emperor. So, again, if you look at the British monarchy, the British monarchy existed before Britain, before the English monarchy existed before England and then Britain became an empire, and it still exists afterwards. The fundamental realities of the monarchy, and particularly of the monarch's own role, haven't been fundamentally transformed by empire. That doesn't mean that empire was unimportant for the monarchy. It certainly was important. The monarchy and its legitimacy grew greatly because of empire. Monarchy played a very important role in British Empire, partly, and this is particularly true of the White Dominions, because by the 20th century, it was actually almost the only constitutional uniting principle. The Queen is still, in principle, Queen of Canada and Australia. Back in 1914, when already the White Dominions were essentially self-governing, the monarchy is a very, very important emotional and constitutional bond, which is why the abdication crisis of 1936 actually is more than just a rather silly, personal, sort of emotional, sexual, God only knows what scandal. Britain's global power and Britain's survival in the Second World War depended on the support of the empire, and particularly on the voluntary support of the Australians, New Zealanders, and above all, Canadians. It is not at all a coincidence that the first thing that happens once George VI is crowned is that he's sent off on a very big tour of Canada. And if you want to have a look at what monarchy meant in terms of the British White Dominions, look at the newsreels of that tour, and then reckon on the payback. Look at Canada's contribution, voluntary contribution to Britain in the Second World War. It's not that Canadian security was involved in any meaningful way. Neither Hitler nor the Japanese threatened Canada. And yet one of the two British armies, British in inverted commas, which invade Northern Europe in 1944 is Canadian. And the Canadians take over most responsibility for the Battle of the Atlantic in the western half of the Atlantic, etc., etc. Very, very interesting. So is there no difference between an emperor and a king? Well, yes, there is. It's a question of a degree, a change, I think, in degree rather than kind. And the best way to define emperor is king of kings. It is a higher status. It implies something more powerful, grander than a mere normal king. And very often emperors, the Roman emperors, but most emperors, had as their subjects people who called themselves kings. One reason why in 1871, the king of Prussia is now called Kaiser, emperor, is precisely because the king of Bavaria, the king of Saxony, and the king of Württemberg are his subjects in a sort of sense, or at least his junior allies. So it's a question of status. It's rising above the mere level of being a king. And, emperors themselves are a sort of hierarchy. I mean, Emperor Kangxi of China would have looked at both Louis XIV and Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor, as rather paltry types of emperor. They were ruling far smaller polities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think at its extreme, what you have is a perception of universal empire, not necessarily literally believing that you rule over the whole globe, but that you are the supreme and leading ruler in what is the supreme and leading civilization in the world. And if you want to get a sense of what it actually means to be an emperor, in some ways, words alone don't suffice. I understand best what it means to be an emperor, or in the fuller sense of the word, at the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, or sitting looking out over the Golden Horn. Then you get a sense of what empire means in terms of pride and confidence, a sense of history, a sense of power, a sort of sense of real importance in terms of the relationship of human beings to the heavens and to history. And that, I think, is part of what it means to be an emperor in the fuller sense of the word.